Hugh, do you want to share your thought? Please turn on your microphone. Unmute.
Come on. There we go. All right. No, I don't have anything to add. I do want to express my appreciation to all the other participants to hear these different perspectives and to get into this conversation. So thank you, Frank and Piyapong, for getting this thing organized. Much appreciated.
We can try to do it again in a different, from a different perspective.
Yeah.
You think
Yeah,
about
I
that?
can't imagine what that would be right now, but I'm sure we can come up with something, Frank.
Well, yeah, critique of deliberation is one of them, but we can.
Well, somebody else has to
think
write a
about
book.
Huh?
Somebody else has to write a book. Good for you, man. Keeping it going. You just never quit with your scholarship.
Well,
I
I don't know
appreciate
about
that.
but it's nice to hear that you think that. Okay.
Oh, I live in a fantasy world half the time anyway.
You mean Florida?
Florida.
Rosana?
Yeah, just to say a couple of words. I'd like to thank Frank for the book. It's truly stimulating, Frank, and makes the foundation of the critical policy inquiry research even clear. I think that your contribution is incredibly valuable to all of us, and I could have some insights from that. And one of these is that maybe the idea of deliberation needs to be rethought. Because what I observe here, but in other Latin America countries, is a kind of new domain about what we considered as before as a progressist instrument of public policy by groups that are not progressists. And so I could give you an example. No, here in Brazil, we have different councils of public policy, and one of them is the Human Rights Council and the Public Council, no, and with a deliberative power. And in the last 3 years, they ended up to be completely fully dominated by non-progressist people, and so what we can expect from this kind of councils is not more good ideas, but old ideas, and they are not trying to guarantee the rights for poor people, for example, or vulnerabilized people, but they are trying to do exactly the contrary. So we fought a lot to have this kind of instrument, and now all of these instruments are invaded, by these non-progressist people. So how can you do this? Because most of instruments were taught in the way that they will be occupied by good people, people with with right concerns about social justice and all. But now it's exactly the contrary. So I don't know what can I think about these deliberative and progressist tools. Do you mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we tend to forget or not want to think about the fact that Donald Trump was, in a sense, democratically elected.
Exactly.
So it's the process doesn't guarantee a just outcome. I think that one thing, which is my last point here, that the deliberative democracy approach took something of an epistemological turn, focusing on arguments when in fact it should take a political deliberative turn. Anyway,
Anyone else? John, okay.
Um, Thank you so much, Frank, for this platform to talk about your book, and especially in sharing our thoughts about the whole situation there in the US and across the globe. I am coming from the Philippines, and I would say that all of the things that you've been talking earlier really make sense as I relate it in my own context. With regards to populism, fake news, and disinformation, which totally boils down to post-truth, I would say that with the current situation in the West right now, we all share the same situation as we are experiencing here with the rise of dictatorship, authoritarian regime, and our ex-president is currently in The Hague in the Netherlands for the crimes against humanity. All this has been propelled and propagated with the spread of disinformation and fake news in the country. And I would say we are all have been suffering with the effects and impacts of the spread of fake news. Um, I totally agree with all the conversations earlier. And I would say that with regards to the idea of having activist academics as part and parcel of, injecting it in the process of like in the direction of critical policy studies and also in our trajectory is not um, has been working in quite some time in other universities. In the Philippines, we have activist academics, and um, they have been engaged in deliberative processes. But the problem that we always encounter is that how do we bring these activist academics to really impact in communities in the real world? So I would say it's a question of like, how do we set up the proper space in bringing these activist academics to really impact on communities, on people, the lay public, and especially in integrating to these policy issues that we are currently facing or currently experiencing. I think this is my some sort of response to the ongoing discussion earlier, and I would love to continue our discussions in June here in Chiang Mai. So just to give a very quick and very brief response to your book on critical policy inquiry, and I kind of somehow read most parts of it, but not yet totally finished reading it. But the book primarily articulates most about the crucial points behind the emergence of critical policy studies and the major debates surrounding policy analysis and how we cannot only rationally approach public policy and decision making, but also engage with policy issues in a manner that is reflective and deeply grounded in contextual realities, which you have presented earlier. Now, I will just briefly share three or few key points I've taken so far from the book and pose three important inquiries that further reflect on the conversation. So, apart for its invaluable contribution to tracing the historical and theoretical evolution, and I think it's a very successful work in the few parts of the book, the role of critical policy studies within public policy. One of the most powerful messages of the book is the effort to really clarify what it means to be critical in the context of policy analysis. Particularly, it's a compelling response to the common misconception of critical policy scholars are primarily skeptical or oppositional. In fact, this is the most important and effective opening message of your book. And it really clarifies that being critical is not really being dismissive, but rather it should be engaging in meaning making unpacking social constructions, and valuing the types of knowledge which you have presented at the later part of the book, all of which are essential to inform participatory and citizen-centered policy process. And this clarification significantly strengthened the direction of critical policy inquiry and address a common mischaracterization of the field. From how I've read and understood the key parts of the book, and please correct me if I misread it, critical inquiry attempts to bridge or at least soften the gap between critical interpretivist, constructivist tradition and the technocratic approach. Ideally, it's crucial for these two camps to engage with each other in the pursuit of sound and inclusive policy alternatives. And this leads me to ask the question, can the idea of critical policy inquiry be understood as a potential bridge for a constructive dialogue with technocratic paradigm? I understand that the position many critical scholars are taking is not merely or entirely reject technocracy, but to demonstrate that there is more to policy knowledge, particularly lived, emotional, and experienced knowledge that is often overlooked or suppressed within technocratic frameworks or paradigms. However, the practical question remains, how do we balance the competing demands of these approaches? In a world where we have limited resources, for example, in the global south and developing countries, where technocratic processes can be resource intensive and deliberative democratic processes can be slow and a little bit messy, how do we navigate these tensions to make policy analysis both practical and critically grounded? And we often talk about crisis, uncertainties, and ruptures. Environmental crisis, climate change is really evident in Southeast Asia right now, sea level rise, changes in temperature, heat waves, and so on, not as universal and monolithic events, but as contextually embedded realities. And while the discourse on post-truth has gained traction in the West, its manifestation in developing countries are far more brave and layered. So populism, authoritarianism, and consolidation of power by strong men are reshaping political landscape, particularly in Asia. These shifts are not just political, but epistemic, and these are rooted in belief systems, as well as values, deeply held social norms. And to some extent, I would say that most Asian countries, or the Asian region in itself, highly believes on technocracy. We have a very long discussion on that one with Piyapong. But in such setting, the challenge to apply a universal framing becomes even more problematic. There is a need to further unpack how we critically approach policy issues through more context sensitive and which are grounded in local knowledge, power dynamics, and cultural meaning making. And one of the most compelling contribution of this book is the effort to advance the idea of epistemic or policy epistemics within the framework of critical inquiry. And this, I believe, a necessary complement to any push towards a more discursive and reflective policy analysis. And while interpretive and social constructivist traditions have made important strides in engaging both ordinary citizens and policy experts in deliberative process, there remain much work to be done in unpacking contested nature of local knowledge. And in particular, there has been increasing attention into recent years to the role of emotions and knowledge and affective dimensions of policy discourse. And this development is not only significant for the field of public policy, but especially for the interpretive and the critical traditions. Now, another key point that I'd like to highlight is the emphasis on participatory governance and the evolving collaboration between citizens and a new category of experts, which you have mentioned in the maybe part 7 or part 8 of your chapter of the book. Now, what is particularly intriguing there is that the emergence of the new type experts, quote unquote, those who are not necessarily product of technocratic or bureaucratic system, but those who have come from activist roots, social movements, and civic engagement. And I think this links up to the recent discussion that we had earlier. These actors bring with them hybrid forms of knowledge, blending normative and empirical insight, and reshaping the terrain of collaborative policy research. The tickling question that I have right now is really like, if we move forward to this activist, critical policy scholars activist, are we creating this new type of experts, as you mentioned in that chapter? This shift is especially relevant in society where technocracy holds significant sway and where public legitimacy is often contingent upon symbolic presence of experts. And we really share it in our context in Asia. In high unequal contexts or high inequality, particularly in parts of Asia, the presence of an expert, quote unquote, even one emerging from non-traditional background, can play a key role in navigating and legitimizing this kind of policy process. This raises important epistemological and empirical question. How do we understand the knowledge this new expert produce? And how do we theorize the role in shaping and co-producing policy with citizens, and how this kind of hybrid collaboration be strengthened to challenge dominant models of knowledge production? And the last point that I would like to point out here is that you also briefly mentioned, and I believe this is a crucial starting point for a deeper critical policy inquiry discussion, especially in the context where values and belief systems are shaped by how individuals interpret the world. In such context, understanding how preference and behaviors require going beyond surface level engagement. And this is the concept of tacit knowledge that you mentioned in the last chapter. How can we methodologically and ethically uncover these deeper layers of knowledge? And once revealed, how do we ensure that these forms of knowledge are treated as equitable and representative of the collective rather than reinforcing existing inequalities or misrepresentation? So as a final note for your book, Frank, this will ultimately offer, the book ultimately offers is not only a profound contribution to critical policy studies, but also a strong invitation to scholars, particularly for me as early career researcher, to extend and complement the work that Hugh has carefully laid out. And in chapter 9 in particular, this opened a space for urgent and challenging questions that can push forward the field of critical policy studies. And it inspires us to ask, how do we rethink critical policy inquiry in the light of epistemic, political, and ecological crisis? And how do we ensure that our research is not only theoretically grounded, but also attentive to the lived realities of those most affected by policy? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, John. I would say, just in a quick response, well, I'd say first, this is a big agenda of items that we can talk about in Chiang Mai, which we surely will do in July. But you touched on something really important, namely the activist scholars. I think that it's correct to say, you seem to be saying, that they should work with the communities. And when we say this, it becomes a much more tangible thing when we just say to shape power and so forth at higher levels, the Trump agenda and so forth, then it's hard to find these openings. But we can much more easily work with local communities. And I would suggest that in doing that, we could actually use that as an experimental activity to explore these kinds of knowledges, how they can work, what they would be like, and how they can work. And the local community approach, of course, is not limited insofar as probably the solution is to build from the bottom up anyway. I don't think the bottom up can do the whole story, but the bottom up has to work its way up to meet a progressive movement from the top down. I think these two have to come, but I think the local community is a good place for us to be involved in these kind of deliberative discussions. I think Piyapong has to probably go ahead. No.
We have classrooms and students, and these students go on to take positions in the governmental.
Yeah. What I was going to say too, also, coming back to your point about planning, in the 60s, there was a conception of planning as an activist advocacy endeavor, as opposed to just an technical activity. But that
Oh, there still is.
Yeah, much more so than in policy analysis. Planning is quite a different thing.
Okay, we already spent 2 hours together.
Yeah.
So, thank you again, everyone, for joining the webinar, the book talk, especially thanks, Frank, for sharing your new books and also try to connect to the current situation. So, of the conversation here gonna be edit and upload to the platform of the critical policy study networks. If you not yet subscribe, please do that. Okay. Do you have any concluding remark, Frank?
I
If
just
no,
want to say thank you for providing the opportunity for me to do this. Thank you.
okay.
I'll second
this-
that, Piyapong. Thank you very much. Nice work.
Okay, then let's call it a day.
Very much.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.